The autumn rain drummed against the windows of my small apartment in downtown Seattle, each drop echoing the hollow feeling in my chest. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of medical bills that had been mounting for months, each one a reminder of Dad's final battle with cancer. The silence was broken only by the hum of my old refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Pine Street. My phone buzzed with another text from Mom, the same dismissive tone she'd used since Dad's funeral 3 months ago. "Sarah, we need to talk about the money situation," it read, and I knew exactly what that meant. She wanted to discuss Dad's life insurance payout, the one that was supposed to help me finish nursing school and start fresh. But knowing Mom, this conversation would be anything but simple. I pulled on my rain jacket and headed out into the gray Seattle evening, my boots splashing through puddles as I made my way to the bus stop. The familiar weight of financial stress pressed down on my shoulders like the heavy Pacific Northwest clouds above. Mom had always been the type to take control, to make decisions for others under the guise of knowing what's best. But this time felt different, more urgent, like she was hiding something behind her usual authoritative demeanor. The bus ride to her house in Bellevue gave me time to prepare myself mentally, watching the city lights blur past the rain-streaked windows. I had no idea that this conversation would change everything between us, setting in motion a chain of events that would test every fiber of our already strained relationship. The familiar scent of vanilla candles greeted me as I stepped into Mom's perfectly organized living room, where everything had its place, and nothing was out of order. She sat in Dad's old recliner, a cup of tea in her hands, her silver hair pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn for as long as I could remember. "Sarah, honey, sit down," she said, her voice carrying that tone she used when she was about to deliver news I wouldn't like. I settled into the couch across from her, noticing how she avoided eye contact, instead focusing on the family photos that lined the mantel. The silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken tension and the weight of recent grief. I could feel my heart rate quickening, sensing that whatever she was about to say would shatter the fragile peace we'd maintained since Dad's passing. "I've been thinking about the insurance money," Mom began, her fingers drumming against her teacup in a nervous rhythm I'd never seen before. $50,000 is a lot of money, Sarah, and I'm not sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility." Her words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. Dad had specifically named me as the beneficiary. We'd discussed it during his final weeks, and he'd made his wishes crystal clear. "What exactly are you saying, Mom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. She finally looked at me then, her eyes cold and determined, and I realized that the woman sitting across from me was not the mother who had raised me, but someone else entirely. "I'm saying that I think it would be best if I managed that money for you," she continued, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. "You're only 24, you're still in school, and you don't have experience handling large sums of money." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt my hands clench into fists in my lap. This wasn't about my age or experience. This was about control, about Mom's inability to let go of the reins, even when it came to something that wasn't hers to control. "Dad left that money to me, Mom," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "He trusted me to use it wisely, to finish school and build a future for myself." But even as I spoke, I could see the stubborn set of her jaw, the same expression she'd worn when she'd made unilateral decisions throughout my childhood. The next morning brought no relief from the storm, both outside and within our family. I sat in my favorite corner booth at Pike Place Market's coffee shop, watching the early morning vendors set up their stalls through the rain-streaked windows. The familiar bustle of the market usually calmed me, but today everything felt different, tainted by the conversation with Mom. My phone rang, her name flashing on the screen, and I hesitated before answering, knowing that whatever she had to say would only make things worse. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation last night," she began, her voice carrying a false brightness that immediately put me on edge. I've already spoken to my financial advisor, and we think it would be best if you sign the paperwork to transfer the insurance funds to an account I can manage. The audacity of her words took my breath away, and I felt the familiar knot of anger forming in my stomach. You spoke to your financial advisor about my money? I asked, my voice tight with barely controlled fury. The elderly woman at the next table glanced over, and I lowered my voice, not wanting to create a scene in public. Mom, that money is mine, legally and morally. Dad wanted me to have it, and I'm not signing anything. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long, and I could practically hear her calculating her next move. Sarah, you're being naive, she finally said, her tone shifting from false sweetness to cold authority. You don't understand the complexities of financial management, and I won't stand by and watch you waste your father's hard-earned money. The hypocrisy of her words stung. She was the one who had pressured Dad to take out that life insurance policy in the first place, claiming it was for my future. I spent the rest of the day walking through the city, trying to process the magnitude of what Mom was attempting to do. The rain had stopped, but the gray clouds remained, matching my mood as I wandered through Pioneer Square and down to the waterfront. Fellow students from my nursing program texted about study groups and upcoming exams, but I couldn't focus on anything beyond the betrayal I felt growing in my chest. By the time I reached the ferry terminal, I had made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and searched for Estate Attorney Seattle, knowing that I needed professional help to navigate this situation. The first lawyer I called, Marcus Chen, agreed to meet with me the next day, his calm voice over the phone offering the first glimmer of hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. The law office was located in a sleek downtown building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay. Marcus Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Tell me about your situation, Sarah, he said, settling behind his desk with a legal pad and pen. As I recounted the events of the past few days, I watched his expression grow increasingly serious, his pen taking notes with practiced efficiency. Your mother has no legal right to that money, he said finally, his voice firm but gentle. Your father named you as the beneficiary, and that designation is legally binding. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but Marcus held up a hand before I could celebrate. However, he continued, there are ways she could potentially challenge this, especially if she can prove that you're not capable of managing the funds responsibly. The weight of his words settled over me like a cold blanket, and I realized that this battle was far from over. What she's doing is called financial coercion, and it's more common than you might think, especially in cases involving inheritance or insurance payouts. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. The good news is that we can build a strong case to protect your rights, but it's going to require patience and documentation. He pulled out a folder and began outlining the steps we would need to take, each one designed to create an unshakable legal foundation. From this point forward, I want you to document every interaction you have with your mother regarding this money, every conversation, every text message, every attempt she makes to coerce you into signing anything. As I left the law office that afternoon, I felt a strange mixture of empowerment and dread. The Seattle skyline stretched out before me, familiar, yet somehow different now that I understood the gravity of the situation I was facing. Marcus had given me homework, to gather all the documentation related to Dad's insurance policy, to start keeping detailed records of Mom's behavior, and to prepare for what could be a long and difficult legal battle. The walk back to my apartment felt like a journey into unknown territory, each step taking me further from the daughter who had trusted her mother implicitly, and closer to the woman who would have to fight for what was rightfully hers. I knew that the coming weeks would test not just my legal rights, but the very foundation of my relationship with the woman who had raised me. 3 weeks passed in a blur of classes, clinical rotations, and careful documentation of every interaction with Mom. My small apartment had become a makeshift legal office, with manila folders organized on my kitchen table, and a notebook dedicated to recording the increasingly aggressive phone calls and text messages. The autumn in Seattle had turned particularly harsh, with early frost covering the windows each morning and the days growing shorter as we approached Thanksgiving. Mom's tactics had evolved from subtle manipulation to outright threats, including a particularly disturbing voicemail where she claimed I was destroying the family by being selfish and ungrateful. Each message was carefully saved and transcribed, adding to the growing pile of evidence that Marcus assured me would be crucial if this case went to court. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I returned from my pediatric nursing rotation to find Mom waiting in my apartment building's lobby. She looked different, older somehow, with dark circles under her eyes and a manic energy that immediately put me on alert. "Sarah, we need to talk," she said, standing up from the worn leather chair where she'd been waiting. "I've been thinking about this situation, and I realize I may have been too harsh." The sudden change in her tone should have been a relief, but instead, it sent warning signals through my nervous system. I'd seen this behavior before, the sudden shift from aggression to false sweetness that usually preceded her most manipulative moves. "Let's go upstairs," I said carefully, knowing that refusing would only escalate the situation. Once in my apartment, Mom launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about family loyalty and financial responsibility. She pulled out a folder thick with documents, spreading them across my coffee table like a dealer laying out cards. "I've consulted with 3 different financial advisors, and they all agree that putting this money into a trust would be the smartest move," she said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when she expected immediate compliance. "I've already had the paperwork drawn up. You just need to sign here, here, and here." The documents were legitimate looking, filled with legal jargon and official seals. But something about the whole presentation felt wrong. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the first page, scanning the dense text for any indication of what I would actually be signing. "I need time to review these with my attorney," I said, setting the papers down gently. The transformation in Mom's demeanor was instantaneous and terrifying. Her face flushed red, her eyes narrowed to slits, and when she spoke, her voice was barely controlled fury. "Your attorney?" she spat, the words dripping with disdain. "You hired an attorney to fight your own mother? After everything I've done for you? After all the sacrifices I've made?" She began pacing around my small living room like a caged animal, her hands gesturing wildly as she built momentum. "You ungrateful little girl. You have no idea what the real world is like, what it takes to manage money responsibly." The verbal assault continued for what felt like hours, each word designed to cut deep and shake my resolve. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, I found myself growing stronger, more determined to see this through to the end. "Mom, stop," I said, my voice cutting through her tirade with surprising authority. "This isn't about gratitude or family loyalty. This is about respecting Dad's wishes and my legal rights." The room fell silent, except for the sound of her heavy breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside. "You want to know what's really going on here?" I continued, standing up to face her directly. "You're struggling financially, and you see Dad's insurance money as your way out." The accuracy of my words was confirmed by the way her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "I've done my research, Mom. I know about the second mortgage on the house, the credit card debt, the loan you took out against Dad's retirement account during his illness." Each revelation hit her like a physical blow, and I watched as the carefully constructed facade of concerned motherhood crumbled away. "You don't understand," she whispered, sinking back into the chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "I'm drowning, Sarah. The medical bills from your father's treatment, the funeral expenses, the house payments. I can't keep up." For the first time in weeks, I saw not the manipulative woman who had been trying to steal my inheritance, but the grieving widow who was terrified of losing everything she had left. "I thought if I could just manage the money for a while, I could get back on my feet and then give it back to you when you're older, more established." The admission hung in the air between us, and I felt a mixture of compassion and disappointment wash over me. "But that's not your decision to make," I said gently. "And the way you've gone about this, the lies, The manipulation, the threats. That's not love, Mom. That's desperation, and it's destroying what's left of our relationship. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were marked by an eerie silence from Mom, broken only by the occasional text message asking about my school schedule or health. I threw myself into my nursing studies with renewed focus, finding solace in the clinical precision of medical procedures and the clear-cut nature of patient care. My classmates noticed the change in my demeanor. I was more serious, more focused, but also more isolated than I'd ever been. During study sessions at the hospital, I found myself gravitating toward the windows overlooking the city, watching the early winter storms roll in from the Pacific, and wondering if Mom was watching the same gray skies from her house in Bellevue. The weight of our fractured relationship pressed down on me like the low-hanging clouds, but I refused to let it derail my future. Marcus had been busy during this quiet period, working behind the scenes to build our case, while also attempting to negotiate a peaceful resolution. "I've reached out to your mother's attorney," he told me during our weekly meeting in his downtown office. "Apparently, she's hired someone to represent her interests, which means she's taking this seriously." The news should have been encouraging. It meant we were moving toward a legal resolution. But instead, it filled me with a profound sadness. "She's really going to fight me for this," I said, more to myself than to Marcus. After everything Dad went through, after all his careful planning to make sure I'd be taken care of, she's going to drag this through the courts. Marcus nodded sympathetically, his expression reflecting the gravity of the situation. "I'm afraid it looks that way. But Sarah, I want you to know that we have a very strong case. The documentation you've gathered, combined with the clear terms of the insurance policy, gives us an excellent foundation." The first formal legal meeting was scheduled for the Tuesday before Thanksgiving in a sterile conference room at Marcus's law firm. I arrived early, my hands shaking slightly as I sipped coffee from a paper cup and reviewed my notes one last time. When Mom walked in with her attorney, a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and cold eyes, I barely recognized her. She looked like she'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame, and there was a defeated quality to her posture that I'd never seen before. "Hello, Sarah," she said quietly, taking the seat across from me at the polished conference table. "Hello, Mom," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The formal setting made everything feel surreal, like we were strangers negotiating a business deal rather than mother and daughter trying to resolve a family crisis. The meeting was a masterclass in legal maneuvering, with both attorneys presenting their cases with professional detachment while Mom and I sat in uncomfortable silence. Her lawyer argued that I was too young and inexperienced to handle such a large sum of money, citing my student status and lack of employment history as evidence of financial irresponsibility. Marcus countered with documentation of my academic achievements, my responsible handling of student loans, and most importantly, the clear legal language of the insurance policy that named me as the sole beneficiary. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength, "we have documented evidence of Mrs. Thompson's attempts to coerce my client into signing over her legal rights to these funds, including recorded voicemails and text messages that constitute financial abuse." The room fell silent as he played one of Mom's more threatening messages, her voice echoing off the conference room walls with unmistakable menace. I watched Mom's face as her own words were played back to her, seeing the moment when she realized how her desperation had transformed her into someone neither of us recognized. Her attorney whispered something in her ear, and she nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging with defeat. "My client would like to request a brief recess," her lawyer announced, and they stepped outside the conference room for what felt like an eternity. When they returned, Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. "Sarah," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, "I need you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. I was scared, and I thought I was protecting you from making a mistake." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with regret and the weight of all the damage that had been done. "But that wasn't your choice to make, Mom," I replied, my own voice thick with emotion. "Dad trusted me with this money, and more importantly, He trusted you to respect his wishes." The truth of those words seemed to hit her like a physical blow, and she closed her eyes as if in pain. "I know," she whispered. "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Her attorney cleared her throat and announced that they would be withdrawing their claim to the insurance funds, effectively ending the legal battle before it could truly begin. The paperwork was signed with swift efficiency, but the emotional aftermath would take much longer to resolve. As we prepared to leave the conference room, Mom reached out and touched my arm gently. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Just us, without the lawyers?" I looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly, and followed Mom out into the hallway, both of us stepping into uncertain territory. The conversation that followed in the quiet hallway outside the conference room was unlike any we'd ever had. Mom leaned against the wall, her professional facade completely gone, replaced by raw vulnerability I'd never seen before. "I lost myself after your father died," she began, her voice barely audible. "Not just the grief, but the fear of being alone, of not being able to manage everything by myself." She explained how the medical bills had piled up, how Dad's retirement account had been depleted, how she'd been taking money from her own savings to keep the house. "I convinced myself that taking control of your inheritance was protecting you, but really I was trying to protect myself." The honesty in her words was both painful and liberating, finally putting names to the emotions that had been driving her behavior for months. "I was drowning, Sarah, and I grabbed onto your life preserver instead of asking for help." We found ourselves in a nearby coffee shop, sitting across from each other in a corner booth, while the pre-Thanksgiving crowd bustled around us. The conversation was difficult, filled with long silences and careful words, but it was also necessary. "I don't know how to forgive you for this," I said honestly, stirring my coffee absently. "Not just for trying to take the money, but for the way you did it. The manipulation, the threats, the way you made me feel like I was the problem." Mom nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me right now," she replied. "I just hope that someday, maybe we can find a way back to being mother and daughter again." The weight of her words settled between us, and I realized that this was both an ending and a beginning. The end of the naive trust I'd always had in her, but potentially the beginning of a more honest relationship. The following weeks were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and setting boundaries. I used a portion of the insurance money to help Mom with her most pressing debts, not out of obligation but out of choice, a distinction that felt crucial to both of us. She began seeing a financial counselor and a therapist, working to understand both her practical situation and the emotional patterns that had led to such destructive behavior. "I want to earn back your trust," she told me during one of our careful coffee meetings. "I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm committed to doing the work." The progress was slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was genuine, and I found myself cautiously optimistic about our future relationship. Spring arrived early in Seattle that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. I was nearing the end of my nursing program, with job offers already coming in from several local hospitals. The insurance money had given me the financial stability to focus on my studies and plan for the future, without the crushing weight of debt. More importantly, it had taught me valuable lessons about standing up for myself and recognizing manipulation, even when it comes from someone you love. Mom and I had settled into a new normal. Weekly coffee dates where we talked about everything except the legal battle, slowly rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than blind trust. "I'm proud of you," she said one afternoon as we walked through Pike Place Market together. "Not just for fighting for what was yours, but for the way you handled everything. You're stronger than I ever was at your age." The final chapter of our story came 6 months later, at my nursing school graduation. Mom sat in the front row, her eyes bright with genuine pride as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. The insurance money had served its intended purpose, helping me build the future Dad had envisioned for me. But the real victory was more complex. I had learned to set boundaries, to recognize my own worth, and to understand that sometimes loving someone means refusing to enable their worst impulses. Mom had learned that control isn't love, that trust must be earned and maintained, and that facing your problems honestly is the only path to real solutions. As we posed for photos after the ceremony, I realized that while we would never go back to the naive relationship we'd had before, what we were building now was stronger and more authentic. The woman who had once laughed at me and said I'd never see that money again now stood beside me, not as the controlling mother I'd always known, but as someone who had learned to respect my autonomy and strength. It wasn't the ending either of us had expected, but it was the one we both needed.